And as we begin, I would like to invite the Director of the Institute for Ethics and Society, Professor John Lippert, to give a welcome. Thank you, John.
Thanks very much, Megan, and welcome everyone to the Institute for Ethics and Society's 2022 Bioethics and Healthcare Ethics Annual Lecture. As Megan said, I'm Professor John Lippert, the Director of the Institute. I'm delighted that you can join us online today in whatever time zone you happen to be in. So my colleague Megan Best will chair today's proceedings and introduce our esteemed lecturer in a moment. But before I do, a very brief word about the Institute for anyone who may be unfamiliar with us. So we're a national multidisciplinary research institute of the Faculty of Education, Philosophy and Theology here at Notre Dame, Australia. And our research falls into three main areas: moral philosophy and ethics education, religion and global ethics focused on the politics and sociology of religion, and the area which is hosting today's event, bioethics and healthcare ethics, which Megan convenes. So overall, we're interested in exploring the connection between good lives and a good society. Our research aims at better understanding how cultivating the virtues can strengthen civil society and support human flourishing. And we're also committed to engaging with key issues in bioethics, including the intersections between healthcare and spirituality in various dimensions, today's topic, and with the significant role that religion plays in social and ethical questions. And the interest that today's lecture has generated is indicated by the large number of registrations for today's event, either to attend in person or to view the recording. So it's great that so many of you can join us. You're more than welcome. But without further ado, I'll hand back to Megan to introduce our theme, esteemed speaker and respondent, and the structure of today's proceedings. Thanks very much.
Thank you, John. We will hear from Professor Ken Pargament in a moment, and then we will hear from Ms. Kate Bradford, who will give a response to his presentation, and then you will all have an opportunity to ask questions. I think it would help us if, as a question occurs to you, you just note in the chat box that you'd like to ask a question, and then I'll invite you to ask your own question of Professor Pargament as your turn comes. Could you please ensure that your microphone is turned off throughout the presentation? Thank you. And I'd now like to introduce Professor Ken Pargament. Kenneth Pargament is a Professor Emeritus of Psychology at Bowling Green State University and Adjunct Professor in the Menninger Department of Psychiatry at the Baylor College of Medicine. He has published extensively on religion, spirituality and health. His books include The Psychology of Religion and Coping, Spiritually Integrated Psychotherapy, Working with Spiritual Struggles in Psychotherapy, and Dr. Pargament was Editor-in-Chief of the APA Handbook of Psychology, Religion and Spirituality. He was Distinguished Scholar at the Institute for Spirituality and Health at the Texas Medical Center and has received multiple prestigious awards for his work in the psychology of religion and spirituality. These include awards from the American Psychiatric Association, the National Samaritan Center, the American Associations of Professional Chaplains, the APA, and he received an Honorary Doctor of Letters from Pepperdine University in 2013. He was recently cited as one of the 50 most influential living psychologists in the world. It is my very great pleasure to welcome Professor Kenneth Pargament to deliver the IES Bioethics and Health Ethics Lecture for 2022. Thank you, Professor Pargament.
Thank you very much. Let me open up my Zoom here. Oops. Here we go. Okay. Let's see here. Well, it looks like I'm having a little bit of a glitch getting to the Zoom. Let me see.
You're trying to share slides?
Yeah, well, I need to get back to opening the meeting because I was, okay, here we go. Okay. Okay, very good.
Excellent. We can see your slides.
Okay, good. The most worrisome part of the event is over now for us.
You can
Thank
relax.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm honored to have been invited to give this lecture. And my thanks to Megan Best and to John Lippett and Kate Jones for guiding me through some of this. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. I also would like to thank the John Templeton Foundation that's provided support for a number of the studies cited in this talk and in my work in this area. And my deepest thanks go to my colleague, my wonderful colleague, and Julie Exline from Case Western University, who has been working with me for over 10 years in the area of spiritual struggles. If you'd like to take a deeper dive into the topic that I'm going to be describing today, we do have a book that just came out, Working with Spiritual Struggles in Psychotherapy, that you can find just by Googling my name online. That's my only plug that you'll hear from me in this presentation. Let me preface this talk by noting that even though I'm going to focus on a potentially problematic side of spirituality, that the research is very clear. Spirituality is of importance and generally positive value to many people in the world today. And just a few examples of that before we start focusing on spiritual struggles. This is a interesting figure that came out 2 years ago. It was done by an economics professor in Europe. And this shows the number of searches for the Google searches for the term prayer. And as you can see, the dates February 1st to April 1st, this was the time when the reality of COVID began to impact us. We became aware of it in this month. And you can see this sharp increase in the slope from February to April 1st. And it speaks to the power of religious resources for many people in times of stress when they're really put to their greatest tests. Religion and spirituality are for many people important resources that they turn to in coping. And in fact, there's a large body of literature now that demonstrates the power of positive religious coping. And by that, I'm talking about reframing stressful events in more benevolent, ultimately hopeful terms, seeking out support from some sort of higher power, looking for support from religious communities. These are positive religious coping methods. And a meta-analysis of over 100 studies on stress-related growth, that is, people who report significant transformational change as a result of the stressors and traumas they've been experiencing. That meta-analysis examined a number of predictors of stress-related growth: optimism, social support, secular coping, and positive religious coping methods. And this study showed that positive religious coping was the strongest predictor of stress-related growth. Strongest predictor of stress-related growth. Again, a potent force in people's lives. How is it that spirituality is a potent force? Well, first of all, it deals with matters of deepest significance. Spirituality is, the way it's often defined, an effort to form a relationship with something sacred in one's life, be it a theistic sacred core or other parts of life that may be perceived as sacred, such as family, nature, work, the arts, social justice. All of these things can be seen as sacred objects. That's the focus of spirituality. Spirituality also is particularly designed to help people come to terms with human limitations and frailty and finitude. I think Western cultures have as their emphasis mastery and control, helping to extend life on human capacities. And I mean, that's very good, and it's good that we're trying to increase our mastery in the world, but the reality is that we're frail, finite beings. No matter how much we try to extend our health and our life expectancy, we're still mortal beings, and we still will eventually die. How do we come to terms with that? How do we come to terms with events that are largely out of our control? That there's no shortage of these events nowadays, from climate change to socio-political dramatic conflict and war, to COVID. Spirituality is designed to help people come to terms with these limitations. And finally, spirituality offers an organizing force for life, a way of putting the bits and pieces of life together into some kind of coherent whole. And I think for these reasons, spirituality remains a very important part of people's lives. Spirituality is generally successful in helping people find meaning and significance in life. And it's also quite resilient to stress itself. So people sustain their spirituality generally, even in difficult times. But even though it's generally quite resilient, there are times when people are shaken to the core, when they encounter internal or external stressors that pose a challenge to their deepest, most sacred values. They call into question our understanding of whatever we may hold as sacred itself. And when that happens, the ground is no longer steady. It's no longer secure. And we do feel shaken in a very fundamental way. I want to give you an example of that process, an example of what we have called spiritual struggles. Even though I'm an academic clinical psychologist, I've kept my hands in clinical practice for many, many years now. And I want to tell you about one of my cases that I saw many years ago that really helped shape this work. I'll call him George. When I met him in the waiting room of my office, George looked like a man who was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He was bent and haggard with deep-set red-rimmed eyes and seemed to stare off in the distance without seeing anything. Before I could take him back to my office, he started repeating, "My brother Joe is dead. My brother Joe is dead." I said, "Well, George, why don't you come back in my office and we can talk about your brother?" Eventually, he followed me and took a seat. And again, for the first few minutes, kept repeating, "My brother Joe is dead." And I recall that my feeling was that this reality had gotten stuck in his throat, and he couldn't swallow it. He couldn't digest that reality of the death of his brother. So after a few minutes, I asked him to tell me a little bit about his brother, Joe. And what followed was, I think, a powerful example of a spiritual struggle. I learned that within the last 3 years, George had experienced the loss of both of his parents from cancer and heart disease. He had lost both of his adult sons, one to a neuromuscular disorder and the other to pancreatic cancer. On the way to the cemetery burying his brother Joe, his sister was paralyzed by a stroke from half of her body. His wife had become so depressed she was suicidal. These weren't George's first experiences of loss. He was a Vietnam veteran and told me about an incident in Vietnam where he was on a combat patrol, and his patrol was taking a break, and they drew straws to see who would get water for the patrol. George lost and went to the nearby stream to get water. And while he was gone, his unit was mortared and they were all killed. George was the only survivor. George had been a preacher in the AME Church, African Methodist Evangelical Church, Methodist Episcopal. He had been sustained by his faith for much of his life. And he was very proud of his role in the church. He was proud of the fact that he had raised his two sons to become important members of his community. It was a disadvantaged community, and a lot of people there were dealing with drugs and crime, but his two sons were active in the church and had done very well in their lives, and George is very proud of them. Now, George was a primary caretaker for all of the family members who had died, so he was by their sides as they experienced painful death. I asked George what was the most difficult, painful part of his experiences, and he answered with one word: why? Why, he asked, was God putting him through this hell? Why had God singled him out for this misery? He saw other young men in his community the same age as his sons, and they were involved in gangs and crime and drugs, and they were healthy and alive. Why hadn't God taken them, he asked. His brother Joe, George said, was the best man he ever knew. He had touched everyone he knew with love. Why had God taken Joe? Who was this God? George asked angrily. How could he ever pray to this kind of God again? If this was who God was, George said, this was not a God George could love. If this was who God was, George said, he hated him. So how did I make sense of George? Well, clearly he was suffering from PTSD, but the clinical diagnosis didn't do full justice to his experience. On top of everything else, George was going through a spiritual struggle. Oftentimes in our work with people facing illness or injury or crisis, we overlook the religious dimension, the religious impact of their traumas. But there are times when these religious and spiritual conflicts and tensions and questions and doubts may be the most important issues that people are facing. And this was certainly the case with George. And in this talk, I'd like to suggest that we can't provide full help to people. We can't fully understand them and assist them through their darkest times if we ignore the spiritual dimension of their crises. I'd like to make a few points about spiritual struggles. They're a natural part of life. They're not pathological, but they have profound implications for health and well-being. It may be helpful to think of spiritual struggles as turning points, pivotal points, or a fork in the road that can lead to decline, to growth, sometimes both. Spiritual struggles are often found in the cracks and crevices of human experience. And I think for that reason, they're easy to overlook. What I'm going to try to do is to move them out from the shadows and shed some light on them. And I'm going to suggest that these struggles are a vital topic for healthcare. Let me start by offering a brief definition of spiritual struggles. Spiritual struggles refer to experiences of tension, strain, and conflict about sacred matters with the supernatural, within oneself, and with others. Julie Exline and I have distinguished among types of struggle, three broad types. We have supernatural struggles. These are struggles with God or whoever the individual may hold as sacred. We can find them plentiful in religious literature, scriptures, in Psalms or Jesus on the cross. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? That's a divine struggle, feelings of abandonment. I was giving a talk to a group, actually it was my class on psychology of religion. I was talking about struggles, and I received this email right after the class from an undergraduate who is facing bipolar illness. And she wrote, I'm suffering, really suffering. My illness is tearing me down, and I'm angry at God for not rescuing me. I mean, really setting me free from my mental bondage. I've been dealing with these issues for 10 years now, and I'm only 24. I don't know why he keeps lifting me up just to let me come crashing down again. So I hope you can hear that sense of struggle. This undergraduate isn't rejecting God. She's wrestling with God. Julie Exline took the lead in a project on developing a measure of spiritual struggles. And let me share some items from different subscales. These are some divine struggle items. Feeling God's let you down, anger at God, feeling abandoned by God, feeling punished by God, questioning God's love for you. And there's a demonic dimension to supernatural struggles too, that some people feel they're wrestling with the devil or evil spirits, as we can see by these items. And then we have intrapersonal struggles. These are questions, doubts, and conflicts within oneself about what one believes, the ultimate meaning of life, and the truth of religious claims, and questions about moral issues. For instance, we can find again examples in religious literature on moral struggles. Paul writes in Romans, I do not what I want to do, but I do the very thing I hate. Get that sense of moral struggle, that conflict, wrestling within oneself. Freud would talk about an id superego struggle. There's a really powerful example in a book called The Diary of Peter Moen. And this book came to me through a Norwegian chaplain, a friend of mine, who sent this to me. And Peter Moen was a resistance journalist in Norway during World War II. And he was captured by the Gestapo and tortured to give up the names of his colleagues and friends. And eventually, under torture, he did succumb and gave up names of people he cared about, which was pretty much of a death sentence for the others. And Peter Moen experienced terrible guilt and anguish, a moral struggle about what he had done. He writes, I must recognize with bitter and painful regret how inexpressibly badly I've lived. I've reduced to dust all moral and material values. You may wonder, how did we get this diary? Well, he had had a thumbtack in his jail cell, and using toilet paper, he punched out letters of words, and then kept the toilet paper diary underneath a grate in the bottom of his cell. He was then transferred to a concentration camp by boat. And on the boat, he told a colleague of his what he had done. The boat was sunk and he died, but his colleague survived the sinking and his experience in the concentration camp. And after the war, he went back to the cell and was able to retrieve the diary of Peter Moen. And this is part of it. It's really a powerful document. Here's an example of moral struggle items: wrestling with attempts to follow moral principles, worrying about whether one's actions are right or wrong, feeling torn between what one wants and what knows is morally right, and so on. And then there are ultimate meaning struggles, questions about whether life really matters, feeling as though life may have no deeper meaning, questioning whether life will make a difference in the world. I'd like to point out that these types of struggles we're talking about are they're betwixt and between. For instance, these ultimate meaning struggles, they're in between meaningfulness and meaninglessness. Religious doubt, these questions about religious beliefs, worrying whether one's beliefs are correct, they're betwixt and between disbelief and belief. They're questions. They're in between phenomena, and they're just the kind of phenomena we often see among people seeking out counseling by chaplains and pastors and mental health professionals, people who have been shaken. And then we have interpersonal struggles. These are conflicts that take place with family, friends, or one's religious community around religious and spiritual issues. Again, a few examples: feeling hurt or offended by religious spiritual people, feeling angry at organized religion, conflicts with other people about religious or spiritual matters. So some of these items could apply not only to people who are religiously affiliated, but to atheists, conflict with other people about religious or spiritual matters. Okay, so that gives you a sense of the range of spiritual struggles. Let me make some points about them, what we've learned through our research. They're not a sign of weak faith. Guess who this struggler is? This struggler says, I'm told God lives in me, and yet the reality of darkness and coldness and emptiness is so great that nothing touches my soul. A kind of spiritual emptiness is being described. And some of you may identify this quote. The author is Mother Teresa, who experienced profound spiritual struggles in her work in Calcutta. In spite of the wonderful things she was doing, she was really torn within herself about that sense of emptiness and desolation in feeling God's presence in her life. Spiritual struggles are not uncommon. Lots of famous people have struggled. Let's see if I can get these straight. We have St. Augustine, Galileo, Charles Darwin, Leo Tolstoy, and George Harrison. All bearded men. I don't know if there's a relationship between struggles and being a bearded male. In research we've done, Julie and I, we found that 70% of a large national sample, and this is over 17,000 people, report spiritual struggles at some point in their lives. A half to 1/3 of people report struggles in the last few weeks. Struggles are not uncommon among Christians, Muslims, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, and atheists. And they can be found in virtually every demographic group. Like to show that among people facing illness, struggles are commonplace. In a study of advanced cancer patients at Harvard, 58% reported a spiritual struggle. 30% wondered why God allowed their cancer to happen. 25% felt angry at God. 22% felt cancer was a punishment from God. These are, I think, pretty potent illustrations of the prevalence and power of spiritual struggles. We know that spiritual struggles grow out of the interplay between personal, social, and situational factors. I can't go into all this now other than to point out that struggles are certainly being stimulated by COVID, the experience of COVID among many people. And we see struggles in relationship to natural disasters, climate change, migration. All of these mega cultural issues are, and natural issues in terms of climate are triggering experiences of struggles, profound questions about existential types of issues. Struggles may be natural, but they're often painful and clearly a distressing part of life. Here's an example. This comes from Joan Chittister's book, Scarred by Struggle, Transformed by Hope. And she described the struggle she had within the Catholic Church. She's a Roman Catholic sister, and she experiencing interpersonal religious struggles with her church. And these are not trivial. She described the feeling of that struggle as like drowning, feeling like the waves are pulling her under, upending her and washing her away from a firm emotional shore, like losing your sense of grounding. And she says, day after day, the struggle raged. Struggle is never done without cost. Real struggle marks us for life, she says. I think it's an important quote because it illustrates the important impact struggle can have on people's lives. We're not talking about minor stress here. We're talking about questions that touch the deepest of our existential concerns, feelings of isolation, feelings of meaninglessness, feelings of being out of control, concerns about death and dying. This is the soil of spiritual struggles. So we really need to take them seriously. There are clear connections between spiritual struggles and health outcomes. And the research is quite robust here. I'll just share a few examples of these studies. One study in the United States used a representative national sample. And all the types of struggle that I just mentioned, the 6 types, were tied to significantly greater depression, greater anxiety, less life satisfaction, less happiness. And this is after controlling for a number of variables. There are actually several hundred studies now documenting these links. Here's another one that I just wanted to share as a powerful example. Study of veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan, and they completed comprehensive measures of suicidality. And higher levels of spiritual struggles were strongly tied to suicidality, including the likelihood of future attempts. In this study, struggles were the only significant predictor of suicidality of all the other variables that the researchers led by Joe Currier had included in their equation. And other studies, by the way, have replicated this in terms of the links between spiritual struggles and suicidality. Other studies have shown even more serious effects. Harold Koenig and I conducted a study on spiritual struggles among medically ill elderly patients. It's a 2-year longitudinal study. And we followed up about 600 hospitalized patients over the age of 55 over a 2-year period, during which time 176 died. We found that struggles with the divine predicted increases in depressed mood, declines in physical functional status, and quality of life after control variables were entered. And what we found especially interesting was that struggles with the divine predicted about a 1/5 to 1/3 greater risk of dying after we entered in control variables. Now, we know from the empirical literature that frequency of church attendance increases life expectancy. And it's a pretty robust effect, up to 7 years on average for white people in the United States, 14 years for African Americans. Very potent effect. This is the first study that we've shown a negative effect of a spiritual dimension on mortality. Struggles appear to have are a risk factor for higher risk of dying. In fact, the specific items that predicted greater risk of dying were wondering whether God had abandoned you, questioning God's love for you, and feeling the devil was making this illness happen. So that's interesting and we think important. These findings have been replicated in another study now, and I should add here that there are other studies now linking spiritual struggles to declines in immune status, which may help explain for the links to mortality. So this is just starting to become clarified now in the literature. Generally, this literature on linking spiritual struggles to declines in health and mental health is applicable across religious groups. So it applies to Christians, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims, every group we've run this kind of research with. and other researchers too, we get very similar effects. Even atheists have been shown to demonstrate some negative effects of spiritual struggles on their mental health. And you may wonder how that can be. Well, some of the struggles are not explicitly God-oriented. Some of the struggles involve moral struggles, struggles with other people around religious matters, and so on. And those struggles among atheists are also predictive of depression, anger, and anxiety. One more study I want to just mention to you. This is the most maybe intimidating figure here. I think it's an important study where we, Julie Pomerleau and our research group, were interested in the question of whether or not spiritual struggles may help to explain how it is that stressful life events lead to poor adjustment. It's a well-established field, well-established finding in the field. If you're exposed to major life stressor, it increases your risk of psychological problems and physical health problems. But it's not true for everyone. Some people go through trauma and seem to come out okay. We wondered whether or not spiritual struggles may help explain that connection. In other words, we wondered whether or not life trauma followed by spiritual struggles, that combination may then lead to trouble. And in fact, that's what we did find in this study. Again, a national sample. When people experienced stressful life events followed by spiritual struggles, they were at the greatest risk of decline in adjustment. And what does that say? Well, I think it says that if you see people who've been traumatized in your own healthcare work, in your own chaplaincy or counseling, you want to find out whether they're struggling. You want to assess for spiritual struggles, because the struggles may be an important factor that helps explain the trauma maladjustment connection. And if the struggles are accounting for it, then struggles need to be addressed in the context of clinical care. Okay. But is this the full story? In healthcare practice, we often tell our patients that their experiences may have an upside. Through their pain, through their suffering, through their loss, they have the possibility of finding some opportunities for positive change, growth, life transformation. That's what we tell our patients. I do in my clinical work. Is that true for spiritual struggles? Can spiritual struggles lead to growth? Well, let's talk a little bit about that. Certainly in the world's major religious traditions, we see examples of just that. Major religious figures encountering struggles and coming through the process strengthened and transformed. You can find that in all the major religious traditions. I'd even go so far as to say that could be the major religious narrative, the major story theme of the religious traditions, of how the leaders faced challenges and struggles and overcame them and were transformed by them. For instance, this is a picture of Siddhartha Gautama, who was about to become enlightened as the Buddha, being tempted by the three daughters of the demon Mara. And the daughters represent three temptations of pride, lust, and threat. And the Buddha was able to successfully come to terms with these temptations, overcome them, and that led to his becoming the Buddha, his enlightenment. That's a classic moral struggle. You come to terms with the conflict between temptation and your higher self, and in the process, you can be transformed. So that's just one example. In the classic literature, we can find more modern day examples of this kind of change. Joan Chittister, the Roman Catholic sister that I mentioned to you, Following her struggle, she experienced transformation. She said struggle gives life depth and vision, insight and understanding. It not only transforms us, it makes us transforming as well. I thought that's really interesting. Struggle not only transforms us, but it helps us transform others. We become transforming agents as a result of our struggles if we experience this kind of growth. Well, the puzzling thing in this is if you look at research studies, we don't see a consistent link between spiritual struggles and growth. The findings are mixed. Sometimes we see a connection, but sometimes we don't. At the very least, these findings suggest that people may grow through struggles, but there's no guarantee. We ought to be careful of sentimentalizing spiritual struggles. The data say pain doesn't always lead to gain. Suffering doesn't always build character. Whether it does or not, we're believing at this point it's a much more, it's the kind of question that demands the answer, it depends, which is what drives people crazy. Whether struggles lead to growth, well, it depends. What does it depend on? Well, we're just beginning to do this kind of research, and let me just suggest a few thoughts along these lines. What determines whether struggles might lead to growth or decline? Acceptance. Do you accept your struggle or do you try to avoid it? One study done by Carmen Omig found that people who were high in struggle avoidance or suppression experienced greater anxiety the more struggles they encountered. People who were able to face their struggle, accept their struggle, didn't experience the sharp increase in anxiety as their struggles increased. And it brings to mind a quote by R.D. Laing, the psychiatrist. I love this quote. He said, "There's a great deal of pain in life, and perhaps the only pain in life that can be avoided is the pain that comes from trying to avoid pain." So it's the suppression that produces the problem. Another factor that may shape the trajectory of struggles, finding support. Unfortunately, it's not a given. Struggles can be met with support or with stigma and shame. Julie Exline did a study of adults who were feeling anger toward God. And about half of them felt supported by others when they expressed their feelings. But about half felt some unsupportive response, like judging and shaming. Furthermore, the supportive responses were associated with generally strength and faith, but the unsupportive responses were associated with, again, suppression, continued anger, and substance use. What else? Well, being able to find a resolution to the struggle seems to be really important. In this study I did with Harold Koenig several years ago now, we grouped our medically ill elders into four subgroups. Those who were struggling chronically over time, they had high levels of struggle at baseline and 2 years later. Acute strugglers who were struggling, were high in their struggles at one point in time, but not the other. And then low strugglers, those who weren't struggling at baseline or at follow-up. And the findings were pretty clear that it was the chronic strugglers who were experiencing the greater decline in mental health and physical health. When I presented this to some chaplains years ago, one of them said, "Oh, well, that makes sense. They got stuck in their struggles." And I thought, wow, that's a great way to put it, getting stuck in your struggles. And it also helps explain a lot of the work of chaplaincy, which is helping patients get unstuck, identifying strugglers and then trying to help them get unstuck, trying to find a way of making meaning of their struggle, finding some sort of resolution to their struggle. So we're just beginning to identify some of the factors that that can lead to growth and positive transformation through struggle as opposed to decline. This literature, though, has some important implications for practice. And I just want to conclude with just a few practical suggestions, and then we'll turn it over to you for, well, first we're going to turn it over to Kate Bradford for her comments and then up to questions. So here's some practical recommendations. First, here's what not to do. If someone raises struggles, don't change the subject. I know you may not feel prepared or trained to deal with struggles and may want to get back on familiar territory, but you don't need a PhD in theology to be able to talk to people about their struggles. In some ways, it's not rocket science. We can draw on our basic healthcare relational skills in listening, in empathy, in reflective communication, and talk with them about struggles as you would any other sensitive topic. No need to change the subject. Don't assume you understand. These are some of the most complex, difficult problems people face. And instead of saying, yeah, I understand, the preferable response is, I wonder if you could tell me more. I'm not familiar with that, but I'm really interested. Say more. Don't judge. Remember, many people feel shame and stigma, and they may feel the topic's not appropriate in a healthcare context. And yet, as I've tried to show in this work, it's tied to physical health and mental health. It is part of a person's biopsychosocial, physical, spiritual health and well-being. And so it needs to be part of the conversation. Don't offer easy answers. Again, these are complex issues. There are no easy answers. There are no easy formulas that we can offer. And in fact, I think bromides or cliches, easy fixes will only make matters worse when it comes to spiritual struggles. These are profound tensions and conflicts, and they may take time to sort out. What to do? Ask about spiritual struggles. A question that I routinely integrate into the first session in my work with clients is, so after we've asked them about how their problems have affected them psychologically, socially, physically, how have your problems affected you religiously or spiritually? Which can open the door to dialogue about spiritual struggles. Just a basic question like that. Listen to and normalize spiritual struggles. Simply listening can be a gift. Simply listening can be a gift. In my work with George, I learned that my efforts to try to interpret, offer biblical quotations to him was very unhelpful. George was far more theologically literate than me. He didn't need my pointing out that his story reminded me of Job. He didn't need that kind of quick and easy connection. He needed somebody who could listen to him because he didn't have that. He had no good place to go with his struggles. He couldn't go to his church. They couldn't listen to him. He didn't have friends who could listen to him. They were making matters worse. And so my willingness to listen and just sit there and be present with him was the greatest gift I could give him. And normalizing the struggles. People often feel that they're going crazy with some of these issues, and being able to normalize it is an important part of care as well. Let's get that. Fostering hope. Fostering hope. People who experience struggles may feel like their worlds are falling apart, and there is no hope for them. There's no rebuilding their lives. I found a metaphor that's been very useful for spiritual strugglers and other people too. And it comes out of a Japanese philosophy, wabi-sabi, which is based on the notion that in imperfection, there's beauty. And there's a Japanese art form called kintsugi. Kintsugi involves taking a ceramic and shattering it, and then putting it back together again with gold filigree. So you put the shattered pieces back together again with gold filigree. And here are some examples of kintsugi art. The idea is that in revealing the brokenness, you can create a work of art that's more beautiful than the original unblemished ceramic. And it's a great metaphor for people that I think we see in healthcare, people who may be coming to us feeling quite broken and hopeless about regaining any sense of wholeness in their lives. But kintsugi suggests not only can you regain wholeness, you can move to something that's a work of art that may be more beautiful than what you had before. My clients often tell me after they've terminated treatment that this is probably the most helpful thing I offered them. Matter of fact, one client addressed a thank you note to me, kintsugi. So I took that as high praise, kintsugi. Building bridges with religious communities. This is the kind of work on spiritual struggles where we really need to draw on the expertise of different disciplines. Mental health professionals have no business offering religiously legitimated rituals and counsel. We need to work together in many cases with pastors and clergy and chaplains, I believe, to be really maximally effective. And so I encourage people in the mental health field and healthcare field to have strong connections with religious leaders who are skilled in this area of chaplaincy and pastoral care. Developing creative programs to address spiritual struggles. Here's just one example called The Winding Road. This is a program we developed at Bowling Green State University for college students who are spiritually struggling. And it was designed to help college students who are leaving home from their parents on their own for the first time, facing a lot of independence and questions about moral right and wrong, and what do they believe, what's true for them now that they're out of their homes. So try to help them articulate and normalize their struggles, help develop their personal identities and spiritual identities, develop their coping resources, and facilitate acceptance of struggle. I just want to illustrate a few activities that I think my graduate students came up with these, and I just think they're great. One was we had the students write and share their spiritual autobiographies, tell their spiritual story. We had them share their spiritual struggles. We had them visualize their older ideal spiritual self. We asked them to imagine themselves at the ripe old age of 90, having achieved the role of spiritual sage. And what would their sagacious 90-year-old, what kind of advice would they have to give them? It was really fascinating. We had them share a sacred object with each other. One undergraduate, her father had died when she was a young adolescent. She always carried around an amulet which contained her father's ashes around her neck. Very moving experience. And we had them write a group lament to God, to share their pain, their anger, their feeling of alienation with God as a group. They shared that with each other. The program, in a relatively short period of time, produced really strong changes: declines in struggles, declines in distress, value behavior congruence, and so on. The students, I think, were tremendously relieved and supported by the realization that other people struggle too. And one student said, "I'm okay with the fact that I have struggles now. It's okay for me to be struggling. It's okay not to have the answers. It's a little scary, but that's okay. It's okay to be scared. It's okay to be confused and just take my time, try to figure it out and not let anybody else pressure me about things. Talk about acceptance. Okay, so let me sum up. Oh, one other thing, just real quick. Helping people anticipate struggles before they occur. This takes us out of the clinical realm, but I've often thought that it's sad that adolescents go through adolescence without real exposure to models and conversations around spiritual struggles, because then they're left ill-equipped to deal with them, surprised when they arise, and they shouldn't be. What if they became a topic of conversation around the dinner table, where parents shared their struggles with their kids, and people started to talk about them and normalize them? Or what if they became a topic in the pulpit, where pastors started to share their own struggles and how they'd come to terms with them? So people felt more open and free to talk about the difficult journeys they were going through. Okay, let me sum up. Struggles are a natural part of life. They're what happen when the road is not so smooth, when it's not so open, and when things seem impassable. There can be incredibly painful, as Georgia's story revealed. But they're natural, and they're not pathology. They are, we believe, forks in the road. They can be sources of great distress, but they can also lead to growth and transformation. So we're just learning about what makes the difference. There are no easy answers, and easy answers may make matters worse. So we really need to grapple and be there with people as they're going through their periods of struggle. Again, with George, the most helpful thing I did was simply listen. And it took time for him to make progress. Within a year, George said, well, I'm not fighting with God anymore. God and I, we've declared a truce. That was after a year of counseling, and that's okay. He'd gone to his side of the ring. God had gone to his side of the ring. Health professionals, all of us, I think, have a role to play in spiritual struggles, just as we all have a role to play with physical health and mental health and social well-being. There is no exclusive territory or profession that should be exclusively the territory. Struggles aren't the exclusive province of any profession, just like physical health isn't the exclusive province of any profession. We all have a stake in biopsychosocial, physical, spiritual health and well-being. And we all have a role to play in helping people move towards greater wholeness and growth as they wrestle with their angels. So I think I'll stop at this point. And Megan, I think we're going to shift now for to our discussant, Kate Bradford.
Yes, thank you very much, Ken. That was enormously helpful. Perhaps you could stop sharing your slides now. Thank you very much. Please feel free to let us know if you have any questions by putting your name in the chat box, and I'll call on you when the time comes to ask your question. I will now call on Ms. Kate Bradford to give a response. Kate is a staff chaplain at Westmead Hospital and a pastoral supervisor. Before her chaplaincy role at Westmead, she worked for many years as a paediatric chaplain, taught pastoral care in several settings, and completed a Master of Theology thesis on the practice of soul care in the public space. She's interested in both the supply and delivery of spiritual care through training and supervision of spiritual care practitioners in Australia. She also serves as the Registrar of Spiritual Care Australia, which is the peak professional organisation for chaplaincy in Australia. We're calling upon her knowledge of spiritual struggles in healthcare to offer a response to Professor Pargament's lecture this morning. Thank you, Kate. Kate, you're on mute, and if you would like to put your screens on speaker view, you'll be able to see Kate more clearly. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you so much, Professor Pargament, for your presentation this morning, or the evening where you are. Some years ago in the US, I had the privilege of being introduced to the topic of spiritual struggles in a presentation by your colleague, Professor Julia Exline. The concept of spiritual struggles is one that I've used ever since. It stayed with me as a deeply central aspect of any spiritual care practice. Indeed, not just healthcare, as you also showed us through your presentation. Your wonderfully powerful expression of shaken to the core really does get to the heart of the matter. You very clearly demonstrated the way in which so many key issues that arise within a person's presenting narrative and distress are traces and imprints which hint towards issues of deeper significance. Very often the people we're visiting have no idea why they feel as they do. They are dealing with their presenting symptoms related to a very complex set of circumstances and events that involve, at the very least, change and very often contain loss and grief and timing over which they have very little control. You've made the unambiguous case that there is ample evidence that support the notion that all people have a spiritual dimension to their lives, which may or may not be expressed through traditional religion. And the spiritual dimension that people possess is a deep organising structure that animates and directs their life. And you've shown us that that can be for good and for ill as well. But so often in healthcare, knowing that all people are spiritual and have a spiritual dimension presents yet another mystifying problem. How do we work with another spirituality? And what exactly do we do and why do we do it? Within the disciplines of spiritual care, there's wide agreement on the essentials of providing presence, creating and holding space, accompanying another, attuning to them, as well as deep listening and conducting rituals. But there's far less discussion on the core nature and the inner workings of the spirituality jigsaw puzzle. Your work on spiritual struggles adds a very significant piece to this puzzle, and provides conceptual categories and language. These categories help sensitize our souls to noticing the struggles in others, and the language gives us words to gently help bring these struggles into the light. These categories and language then help us elucidate the nature of spiritual struggles for another, and in turn help them find words for their struggle within us in a safe place. I find your classifications of the types of struggles, spiritual struggles, supernatural, intrapersonal and interpersonal, very helpful. They demonstrate the importance of our spiritual assessments being kept wide and open to a whole range of possibilities, and they remind us to take on board the idea that initial questions of religious faith and practice, when introduced too early, may in fact narrow rather than open out a comprehensive discussion of spiritual concerns. Your further categories of the divine, demonic, moral, ultimate meaning and doubt and interpersonal struggles highlight the extent to which spirituality is always relational. Relationships with the supernatural and cosmic entities, principalities and powers, our relationships within ourselves, our past self, our present self, our future self, our doubting self, our hopeful self, and also our relationships with others, especially with those having some spiritual power over us. All this demonstrates the dynamic nature of spirituality and its capacity to either wither or grow, but holds within it a tremendous possibility because the outcome is not fixed at the beginning, even when the physical and medical outcome is. All of this is such an encouragement to add to our training, which is largely based on versions of non-directive client-centered therapy and following emotions. It encourages me to want to acquire the specific skills in working with spiritual narrative to better identify spiritual struggles. And as you have shown, though difficult, struggles can be very transformative doorways through which we can help a patient pass as they adjust to their ongoing life circumstances. Thank you very much. I really appreciated your lecture, Ken, and I'm sure we all did. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate. We now have a time for questions, and we'll be continuing the webinar until half an hour past the hour. Professor Pargament has kindly agreed to give us more of his wisdom. I'd like to start off by just asking about whether there's any benefit in exploring one's spiritual strengths before spiritual struggles occur. I'm thinking of the diagram where you showed that spiritual struggles could lead to positive health outcomes if positive religious coping kicked in instead of going through the negative coping pathway. I wondered if you could just say something about the benefits of building spiritual well-being prior to this struggle occurring.
Great question, Megan. And Kate, thank you so much for your lovely comments too. I'm very, very appreciative of them. That really touched me. Thank you. I think in terms of your question, Megan, few people come to at least a secular counselor presenting with spiritual struggles as the presenting problem. And so they're not oftentimes what we first focus on, nor should we. I think in the clinical assessment process, I think it makes sense to start with the positive, which is I often talk about, okay, let's talk about the resources in your life that have helped you deal with the situation you're facing, being an illness, a relational problem, some other question that they're going through. What's been helpful to you? And we talk about their social resources, their psychological resources. We talk about, the full range of resources they can draw on. And then I suggest, and your spiritual resources, what resources have you drawn on there to help you deal with the problems you're going through, which gets it off, which helps identify, again, the full range of strengths the person may have. And so I agree that it makes sense to look at spiritual struggles within the context of a larger assessment process. Spiritual struggles usually don't come up, again, because they're not something we typically see, and they're often kind of implicit rather than explicit, in the background rather than the foreground of what the patient is presenting. So we have to learn to see with depth and listen with that kind of third ear, as analyst Theodore Reich talked about. Listen for the signs of struggle. They may not be expressed very directly. I remember I had a patient who had a rape victim, and when she had a very difficult time describing how she'd been impacted by the rape, and I asked her, "Can you give me one word?" And she said she felt contaminated. And that word really struck me as a word that has religious resonance. Contaminated, desecrated, defiled, polluted. All these are rooted in a religious context. And when I explored that with her, she began to open up and talk about how she felt like the rape was in fact had destroyed her soul, and that they were a punishment from God for her sins. And up to that point, there'd been no conversation about this at all, about the rape. And yet the conversation here turned into one in which punishment, feeling punished from God, became the central focus of the therapy. And how could she find some forgiveness from God, from herself, for what she had gone through? So again, but this didn't come up for 6 months in treatment.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Julia from Marta Health. Julia, can you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hello there. Thank you for your talk. Ken, could you say a bit more about how people's own formation in their belief system impacts this whole area of spiritual struggle?
Great question. And we're just learning about that. It may impact it in a number of ways. Basically, we feel that people who have a kind of firmer, stronger spiritual foundation are either less likely to experience struggle, or when they encounter the struggle, are better equipped to handle it overall. For instance, we found that the nature of the individual's attachment with both parents and God, is it a secure attachment? Is it an insecure attachment? Is predictive of whether or not they're going to experience a spiritual struggle. And if they do, how well they're going to resolve the struggle. So having a secure foundation of relationships seems to be something that's another kind of factor that determines the trajectory of spiritual struggles. I'm reflecting on what Kate said, that this is all very relational. And I think she's 100% right. It's very relational, and the quality of the relationships that people have developed in their own across their lifespan from childhood on, is also likely to shape people's encounters with spiritual struggles.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our next question comes from Karen. Karen, can you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, that's great. Thanks.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you so much for your lecture. I'm so glad that it was recorded, because I would like to hear it again. I did just want to ask about the first graph that you showed in your presentation about the Google searches for prayer around the time of the pandemic. I certainly understand the shape of the graph and that the searches went up, but I just wasn't clear on what the y-axis was representing. The terminology wasn't very clear to me. Would you mind clarifying?
Yeah, the x-axis was time over the 2-month period from February 1st to around April 1st. The y-axis was the number of searches for prayer, number of Google searches across people in 30 countries.
It said something about as a proportion of total searches or something, and I wasn't sure how they came up with that particular term.
Yeah, I think they were looking at the proportion of Google searches for prayer over other searches, because the number of searches might have varied day to day, just variation in that. They were particularly interested in Google searches, so they created a proportion for that. She's published a paper on that, actually 2, I believe now, in an economics journal. So if you Google Benson on Google prayer search study, you'll find that.
Thank you. Yeah, I just didn't think that it would be 100% of Google searches for prayer in
Right.
March,
Yeah.
but that must not have been what she meant. Yeah, thank you.
Right. Yeah, you're welcome.
Our next question is from Michael Quinlan.
Thanks very much for your talk, Professor Pargament, and thanks also for the comments from Kate Bradford. My question is a bit broader, and what's been clear from this discussion is how important spirituality and spiritual matters are to people. And from my interactions with the health profession, I'm a lawyer, I'm a professor of law, not from the health profession. It seems to be a complete no-go area for most health professionals in interactions with them, including in areas which you might think there might be some awareness that advice that a health professional might give might actually give rise to spiritual concerns and spiritual problems for patients. I'm thinking here about, speaking to health professionals about contraception or abortion, and New South Wales just has passed voluntary assisted dying legislation. So these sorts of areas where patients present to a medical professional asking for advice, and it really goes to the question of the training of medical professionals. And I think it's evident from this discussion, most medical professionals just wouldn't think of a spiritual dimension in the advice that they give or in their dealings with their patients. So I wondered if you might comment a bit about that.
Yeah, it's a challenge. I mean, it's certainly I'm not familiar with the Australian situation, other than with a few conversations with colleagues there, but certainly in the United States, there's what we call the religiosity gap, the gap between the religiousness of healthcare providers and the patients that we see. In the United States, about 90% of people state that they believe in God. If I pick on my own profession, clinical psychology, about 24% of clinical psychologists believe in God. So there's this religiosity gap. And so a lot of skepticism among in the mental health field and the health field too. The other issue, though, is that in the United States, and it sounds like it's similar in Australia, there's just the problem of lack of training. In the mental health field, most mental health professionals in graduate training have no courses, no coursework on religion and spirituality, none. And so even if they're interested in it, they just don't have the training to kind of move forward, which is really unfortunate. We're doing some work right now. We have a grant that with John Templeton Foundation of trying to catalyze training in spiritual competencies or spiritually integrated mental health care in graduate programs all over the United States. And Cassie Veaton has articulated 16 clinical, spiritual, and religious competencies that health professionals should have mastered in their work, at least a number of them. And I think that's helped pushing things forward too, really trying to really articulate what are the basic competencies we should have in this area, just like basic competencies and other basic competencies in working with other diversity aspects of patients' lives. We should be more conversant in this area.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much.
Our next question comes from Adam.
Sorry, my question's been asked.
Okay, thank you, Adam. Helen Connell. Helen, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for your talk, Ken. I thoroughly enjoyed it. The program that you mentioned, the Long Winding Road program, is there any way that I can read a little bit more about that? I think that's a really interesting way of helping young people, and I've been interested in how I could help primary school children with their own spirituality. But to tackle it from that point of view with young people at the end of their school life, to help them reflect, it would be amazing.
You came in and out a little bit, Helen, but if I understand it, yes, we do have, we've published papers on it, which I'd be happy to send you. And we actually have the Winding Road available on a DVD with manuals for both the students and the leaders of the group.
Wow.
And so that's available, but also a colleague of mine who worked with me on Winding Road, she works in an inpatient psychiatric hospital, and if you're interested, I'd be glad to share it with you.
Oh, thank you very much, Ken. That would be fantastic.
Ken, if you send us any resources, we'll circulate it to everyone on our mailing list. Thank you very much. The next question is from Nick. Sorry, I'm just using the name you've put on your screens. Nick, if you could unmute yourself.
Hello, I'm actually Jenny.
Okay.
I'm a part of a team here in a hospital setting, a pastoral practitioner. And my question about the presentation has been very inspiring. Thank you very much. I'm presently looking at there's a hospital requirement around using a spiritual assessment tool, which is an interesting request, and it connects with the question before the last one, and that was about because the spiritual assessment tool connects with progress notes, which connects with communication with the interdisciplinary team. which connects with education around spiritual, the spiritual experience of patients, and how that is arising and affecting their experience in hospital and their distress and healing potential. So that's where my question arises from, is there a spiritual assessment tool that you would see as a useful tool in that sense?
Yes, again, you kind of went in and out, but if I understand your question, yeah, Julie Exlund and I have developed some measures of spiritual struggles, a long form of 26 items and a short form of 14 items. And in that are, I think, pretty easy and user-friendly. And I'll be glad to send you copies of those both papers, if you'd like that.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Thanks.
If in my book on spiritually integrated psychotherapy, I talk about a more interpersonal approach to spiritual assessment of both resources and struggles. So I have a number of questions and probes that can be woven into conversation to help open the door to a deeper dialogue around both spiritual resources and spiritual struggles. Some of the questions are explicitly spiritual in nature. Others are what we call psycho-spiritual, meaning they're kind of like in between, someplace in that gray zone where they hint of a deeper dimension to people's concerns. And again, those psycho-spiritual questions people have found quite useful in deepening the conversation and setting the stage maybe for a more explicit talk about the struggles people are going through. So, and you're welcome to look at the book, and I can send you a paper on that type of assessment as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question is from Simon Jones.
Hi, good day, Ken. Thanks for your lecture today. I work in mental health, and I just wondered whether spiritual struggles can be considered like a spiritual emergency proposed by Groff and Groff, or a spiritual crisis. I've noted that crisis or crisis, represents like a turning point, and I think people that I've worked with, they enter into like a crisis because they lose their meaning and purpose and hope through their experience of mental illness. But I wonder whether it presents a really great opportunity for strength and growth and resilience out of crisis, because they can sort of rebuild new meaning, new purpose, and it can be seen as an opportunity for growth. I don't know what your thoughts maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. There are a lot of really great work has been done on concepts that are certainly in the same ballpark as spiritual struggles, spiritual emergency, moral injury, spiritual distress, spiritual dryness, what I used to call negative religious coping. I think we're all kind of somewhat in the same broad range. The reason I switched from negative religious coping to spiritual struggles, and why both Julie and I have stuck with spiritual struggles as our preferred term, is because we think it really connotes the possibility of transformation, that you struggle with something to achieve a transformation.
Yeah.
And the struggle is, it's not a pathological process. We struggle our whole lives with things. We struggle cognitively in our development. We struggle in our relationships to achieve what we want. We struggle at work to achieve what we want. And we struggle spiritually to attain are a sense of significance in life. And of everything we've done, I think I'm most comfortable with that kind of language of struggle. It connects to where it offers hope and possibility to clients and patients. So I really like that a lot. In the book itself on working with spiritual struggles, it's really very much a good half of the book is focused on that question of how do you help people in this fork in the road move towards growth and transformation, because it's not a given. It's not a given. And many people, in fact, when they struggle, decline, get sick, and experience powerful losses. So our role in helping professions, I think we have a vital role to help people at that fork in the road move in a positive direction. We make a difference for that. I mean, that's what I'm finding in this research. We make a difference. And the fact that we're not getting educated about it, that we don't have much background in it, that we really need to learn to be able to assess and see and listen for it, and then have some ideas of what are the things we can do to help people on their journey. I think if we had that, we'd really be a lot further along our way to truly holistic healthcare.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we're just about out of time now, and I'm sorry that we haven't gotten to all the questions. We would like to take a photo for our social media feed. So I wonder if you could all smile and we'll just take a photo. Thank you, Tim. I'll assume that's been taken. Thank you.
Sorry,
all.
I didn't get it yet. Could we smile just one more time?
Okay, everyone smile again.
I'll count you in if that's all right. I just need to get the thing up on my screen. Okay, 3, 2. Oh, wait, sorry, there's a blank screen on my... Could you flip your cameras on too if you're there? It just looks really nice if there's a bunch of smiling faces. Sorry about this. I just want to make sure I get it because it's so wonderful to see so many people here. Okay, here we go. 3, 2, 1. Got it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you all so much for attending today. Can you please join me in thanking Professor Ken Pargament virtually for what was a truly excellent presentation. Thank you very much, Ken. I'd also like to thank Kate Bradford for her very insightful response. And I'd also like to thank Kate Jones for all her work in supporting this webinar today. We have recorded the webinar and all registrants will get a copy of the recording. And if you have any other questions about the webinar, please feel free to contact me at the Institute for Ethics and Society at the University of Notre Dame, Australia. I will take a copy of all the remaining questions and I'll forward them to Professor Pargament to see if he will have an opportunity to respond. But thank you all so much for coming. We hope to see you again in the future, and we will now stop our recording. Thank you very much. Bye.